Welcome to the October installment of our VSA webinar series, which comes to you from the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and addresses topics related to the arts and special education. I'm Emily Thiel, the Program Coordinator of Special Education here at the Center, and I will be your webinar moderator. Today's webinar is part of our Lightning Talk series, Voices from the Field, Transition, and the Arts. If you would like to view live stream captioning of this webinar, you can follow the link you see on the slide and in the chat box of the control panel located on the right side of your screen. Before we get going, I'd like to take a brief moment and introduce you to Cisco WebEx Event Center. Broadcast messages from the Kennedy Center team, such as the link for live stream captioning, appear in the chat box, which you can select from the control panel on the top right of your window. If you need to leave the webinar early, you leave it by clicking on the X in the upper left corner. A recording of the webinar will be available afterwards, so you can catch up on any parts you missed. You can connect to the audio portion of the webinar through your telephone or through your computer's microphone and speakers. Select the option that works best for you. If you are using your telephone, please make sure you mute your computer speakers. You can submit comments, questions, or answers to questions using the Q&A option, which you can select from the top panel. Please note that this is different than the chat box and allows moderators to view your questions. Please make sure that your question is directed to all panelists. I will monitor the screen throughout the webinar. If you prefer to speak your input rather than typing it, please click on the Raise Your Hand icon, which can be found in your view on the participants panel. I will touch base with you and unmute your microphone at the appropriate time. Much of today's presentation will be conducted over a screen share. If you would like to adjust your view by zooming in or zooming out, you may click on the magnifying glasses. You may also expand your view to full screen. At the end of today's presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions about the material. Given the very limited amount of time available to us, we respectfully ask that you avoid questions about individual students and focus questions on the broader implication of Jill's work. During the open-ended question and answer time, please raise your hand if you wish to speak or type your question into the Q&A box. Within the week, we will send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's presentation, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, and a copy of the webinar transcript. This means you can go back and watch the recording and review supplemental materials in addition to any notes you take during the webinar itself. Our next Voices from the Field, Transition and the Arts Lightning Talk will take place on October 10th at 12:30 p.m. The registration link can be found in your chat box. If you're active in social media, I invite you to connect with us using hashtag VSAWebinar. On Facebook, we are VSA International, and on Twitter, we are VSAINTL. We would love to engage with you. And with that, I hand it over to today's presenter, Jill.
Give me one moment. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your patience. It took me a moment. Is everyone seeing a PowerPoint screen.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you so much. Had a few technical difficulties today, but I'll be trying to keep this moving along to stay on time. I'm very pleased to discuss a project that I undertook with my colleagues at Make Studio. We're a supported community art studio that primarily serves adult artists with disabilities, and we're located in Baltimore, Maryland. We were recently very excited to be able to produce new programming for younger folks, for transition-age youth, ages approximately 14 to 22, through a contract with VSA and the Rosemary Kennedy Initiative. And so today I'll be speaking briefly about the programming that emerged from our desire to extend successful programming we developed for adults over the last 7 years with younger individuals who were looking to explore and develop relevant skills for pursuing careers in the arts after graduation from school. So I'm going to spend a portion of my time talking about Make Studio in order to give you a better sense of the programming that we had then adapted for younger individuals with disabilities. Make Studio was founded in 2010, and we're an inclusive art center, meaning that we produce programming that is accessible to individuals of all abilities, including workshops, exhibitions, screenings, you name it, throughout the year. But our core program is a studio program specifically for working artists. We currently serve 30 adults in this program, and they come to us from throughout the Baltimore metro area. Our focus really is celebrating self-determination throughout our programming. Our staff comes with different skill sets gained working in special educational settings, as well as being working artists and designers. And we really put the studio first in what we do in order to really focus on individuals' development as artists. A core piece of our programming is that we focus on using high-quality materials. We keep exhibitions and sales of work to the extent that artists wish to sell their work at the center of what we do. And we really do a variety of things which we'll talk about to encourage community engagement. Our program is based in the model of progressive, what we call progressive art studios, formerly more commonly known as art centers for persons with disabilities, a model that was developed by Elias Katz and his wife Florence Ludens Katz, kind of in the late 70s to early 80s. And these programs vary quite a bit. There's probably at least 60 in the U.S. today. But at their core, they all, as their focus, really focus on developing competencies, capabilities, self-advocacy, and connecting the artwork that happens in the studio environment with a radiating impact so that individuals who work in art centers are able to take the skills they've learned and work to cultivate broader acceptance of all people with disabilities in their communities. Something that we think about at Make Studio, because of the genre of art that our artists produce often is characterized as, which would be outsider art, is taking a corrective approach to that view, really thinking about the way that creativity breeds both independence and interdependence, that people who make art in art centers are really radically connected to their communities, shaking up this stereotype of people with disabilities as being isolated, and this idea that outsider art is made in isolation. What we found is that people with disabilities, like artists of all ability levels, really bring in their concerns and the concerns of the wider community into their work, and then they create messages that they want to share visually with others too. So something that has underlaid our program for all people that we work with, and particularly for thinking about transitioning to transition-aged youth, is that we want to create experiences that are within the least restrictive mode or the least restrictive environment, and that takes an active process of thinking about programming that is thoughtful and ambitious about increasing independence, validation, and opportunity. So a little bit more about Make Studio and our 30 artists to set the scene. Our artists, as I mentioned, are artists first. We focus on the studio and Make Studio. And we have individuals who come to us on different schedules, mostly for crowd control, to work in our studio on their own self-developed projects. So here are a few examples of artists at work. doing everything from still life, working from live reptiles, to doing work based on popular characters, to doing portraits, and you name it, whatever the artist desires. And our staff are there to facilitate, to support in making decisions. Our program is set in the building that you see here called the Schwing Arts Center. It allows us to have a dedicated gallery space as well as a really flexible and accessible workspace. And so we took that into devising our program, having youth come to us to work in the studio setting and have a break from their school settings. Artists, as I mentioned, work on self-developed projects that range from everything from painting to wood sculpture, as you see here, also some clay work, mixed media sculpture. We try to provide the necessary basic set of tools so that artists can really run wild with their imagination based on their own interests. But something that we really wanted to emphasize with our transition age program was to pick up on a key piece of what happens in our studio, and that is kind of working the edges of someone's current capabilities. So the two artists here, a young man named Zach on the left and a young woman named Margie on the right, are shown with projects that allowed them to experiment with materials that they'd never used before and to work on bigger scale. And these are artists that, although they've been making art for a very long time, had not felt bold enough for whatever reason to work in the media that you see here. But they found great success in doing that. And so thinking about challenging one's expectations for oneself and pushing boundaries, pushing the edges, and that's something we brought into our transition age program. I'll pause here for a second, do a quick time check. Okay, here's Zach once again, and an example of a staged project, which is something that we emulated in our transition age program, where he worked on a comic over a long period of time with some support from one of our staff members, our studio manager, in order to explore feelings about being a young man with autism. And this is something that he took then and shared and was able to have published and speak about in public. And so, again, this is another example of thinking about pushing the edges of capabilities and bridging between one's inner artistic and creative idea and things that one wants to express and connecting with others around shared feelings and interests. I'm going to, for the sake of time, just move past this, but the next couple of slides are some examples of ways that our artists engage with community members via the internet, on our artist blog, and out in the community at different artists and residents experiences and at exhibitions, speaking with visitors. And these are things that we also brought into our transition program. Theoretically, we've been inspired by arts-based social inclusion, the idea of building interdependence by acknowledging that people with and without disabilities benefit from connecting with one another and reliance and a full sense of community with one another. And we use narrative, visual narratives primarily in artwork making to do that at Make Studio. So moving to our program specifically to tell you what we really keyed in on for this age group is taking that studio experience, that open studio experience that we utilize with adults and distilling it down into a more time-limited experience that was a bit more structured to bridge the structure of the school day with the more openness of one's adult work schedule, or in this case, working as an artist in the studio milieu. So we engendered to create time-limited workshops in which students could be engaged in learning new skills they're interested in or enhancing existing artistic skills. And we did that in such a way that through mentorship with our current artists, as well as support from other guest artists and our staff members, we focused on incrementally creating projects that can be completed in a short period of time that involved challenging problem-solving abilities and challenging existing communication and social skills, things that would really be highlighted in future career development for these students. So young people would come in groups. I think our youngest student was actually 13. Come in groups of about 20 to 25. and stay for half-day or full-day sessions in a semi-structured experience, as I mentioned before. We took a team teaching approach, as I mentioned, and our artists, our adult artists, were there throughout, providing artist talks and demonstrations, as well as just being there as a resource for the students who came to our space. And then there were culminating exhibition opportunities for all students who participated in our gallery. We made a conscious effort to survey the goals, needs, and preferences of all the participating students before they came to the space so that we would have at the ready materials needed and an idea of the extra supports that might be needed so each student could function as autonomously as possible, but with their teaching team while they were in our space. We started each day with artist talks and a studio tour so that everyone could see where their media of choice was. Students would make individual choices about what they would focus on when they were with us. And then what we really did on our side with our teaching teams was to work out the stages of projects. So picking up from that example of Zach from before with the comic, for example, thinking about an ambitious goal, a project that would be a little bit outside the student's comfort zone, and what were the stages, setting the stages that would be needed to complete that project in the time we had available. We also pre-prepared media stations to facilitate this. And throughout the work days, we would promote behaviors that encouraged a productive shared working environment and really tolerating others' preferences and particularities, and working in a studio environment was a key focus for the individuals who ended up coming to our workshops. We also had opportunities to practice constructive critique, so informally and also at the end of each day in a more structured traditional critique setting. And we really spent a lot of time working with students for thinking about the process of their art making as well as what the final product would be like. Individual students worked on. One student was very interested in doing comics-based projects, but had never completed a full comic. So to ultimately work towards a graphic novel project. On the left in this scene is one of our resident artists, Gary Schmeeds, and on the right is one of the attending students, and they worked closely together during his workshop experience. In this scene, there's two students who participated in one workshop, and the student, something that was a wonderful surprise to us that we wanted to share with others was that students who attended together who hadn't known each other before really offered a lot of support to one another, and that's something we want to look towards in future programming. The student on the left is working on a project in cardboard in support of the student on the right, who had chosen that as an initial project to get over some of the anxiety of being in the new space. And this student on the left chose to work with him in tandem with similar materials and a show of support, which really helped both of them to integrate into the studio environment that day. Moving ahead, some students working on clay. We did have some lucky coincidences in terms of what materials students in different groups really want to focus on so that we could really provide a lot of support all at once to some small groups of students as well. And then lastly, in this example, this is one of the exhibition opportunities that we had for one of the groups. The young woman in this photo had been working in 3 dimensions at home for quite some time, but had not really been able to complete a project. So this was very satisfying for her family as well as her to have a finished piece that she could let others see. And it looks like I have a question. I'm almost through. Maybe I'll go ahead and do this last slide. And I'm being icy, I can ignore it. So I'll go to this last slide and then take any other questions that may have popped up. The key lessons learned were that timing of the workshops and timing of projects within them was key. Going from a sort of open type of schedule with our adults to doing something with younger people involved a lot of thinking about what's going to be the most productive experience that is developmentally appropriate, but it's also going to be that kind of gateway to having, working in this more of an unstructured way as an adult post-graduation. We really relied on strong partnerships with adult agencies that we work with, as well as schools. And within the teaching teams that emerged to work with the young people, but also to kind of set up conversations between adult agencies and families to help them in the transition process as a whole, we thought was a really nice silver lining as well. We established or aimed to establish good communication with families from the outset when we were enrolling students in this programming, and to manage expectations, because our community setting is so different from a lot of the other settings and the school settings that families have previously worked with for their children. And then throughout the experience, we really wanted to set high standards and model professionalism so that students would have the sense that process is so important for an artist's development, but that if you're looking to exhibit your work and to sell your work, to be thinking about what standards of quality can be set so that you'll have, you'll achieve that sale or achieve that recognition that you would like to for your end product. And then we had plans A, B, and C, most notably for thinking about how we would offer this program in the summer versus in the fall, or in the spring, when vacations and other kinds of scheduling disruptions were impacting the participation of students. And so in that regard, we went to more of a summer camp model for summer sessions to better serve families. So I hopefully have not run too over, but lastly, just wanted to reiterate my contact information and point everyone to Make Studio's social media to learn more about what we're doing with transition age students, what our adult artists are doing. And as I referenced before, we have an artist blog, saveyourfaves.org, and that's really our artists, that and our Instagram feed are really our artist conduit to the community 24/7. So I really encourage you to check those out. Thanks so much.
We have now reached the question and answer portion of our webinar. If you haven't already, now is the time to enter a question into the Q&A box or raise your hand. And to get started, we have, if you were to advise other community arts programs on providing this kind of career development for transition age artists with disabilities, what are some core values you would suggest all programs of this type to have?
I would say core values, that's a good way to frame it. I think that really celebrating individual voice and individual aspirations is extremely important. Something that we've learned through working mostly with adults, but many of whom are young adults who have sort of just passed out of that transition age period, is that sometimes in the career development process, in the job training process, individual aspirations and goals kind of can take a little bit of a backseat to what seems, realistic and practical. And some of the adults that we've worked with, that's bred a lot of frustration and some resistance, understandable, and hesitancy about trying different things later on. And so we really feel like valuing that individual, that individual goal, that individual aspiration, and seeing how one through appropriate stages can approach that, even with being mindful of pragmatic aspects. So I think really, valuing the individual voice, the individual aspirations, and as well as I think was sort of emphasized in the presentation, building community, thinking about building a community within the setting that you're working with where, so-called clients or students and staff or volunteers, everyone is a valued community member with something to contribute, and that really translates into our artists' ability to engage more deeply with folks in the wider community as well.
Awesome, and we have time for one more question. Can you share a little bit about specific strategies you use to sustain an arts-based, least restrictive environment for young professionals?
Yeah, I would say that for us, least restrictive actually involves, kind of as I sort of implied for the transition program specifically, involves pre-planning. So working with a schedule so that you can set up, working with a schedule as free as possible. So for us, a lot of that means scheduling artists for crowd control, based on how big people like to work with things, but also for thinking about personalities and dynamics. So if we know that two individuals can set one another off, they're just not great coworkers, we want to help them to move towards being better coworkers with each other and other people, but if it's possible and we can have them work at different times or give them the physical space they need to be successful, that's really important. And then physically, going specifically to physical issues, we found it very helpful to create a space that offers, makes navigation extremely easy so that things are laid out in an intuitive way and with adequate space to move around so that once someone's oriented into that workspace, it's really easy for them to just, get started and go and not have to have, any sort of directions or reminders. People can really work very freely.
Great. With that being said, that concludes today's webinar. I'd like to ask you, our webinar participants, to keep your window open following the webinar, where the survey will generate on the screen. Your feedback is always appreciated. Thank you for joining us. For questions or comments, please contact me by email at ecfield@kennedy-center.org or by phone at 202-416-8742. Have a nice day.